Elements of Moral Science by Noah Porter, Part 3, Chapter 2, Second Take on the Sensibilities. We've ended the last video saying that emotions many times are quite complex. Now Porter wants to classify these various emotions, and he recognizes that this is a hard task given their mixed nature. As a method to untangle and pick out the emotions, Porter is going to focus on their triggers. We can better understand this method with an analogy. Let the various emotions be a swarm of different fish, and the lake our mind. Now, as master fishermen, we need specific baits for specific fishes. These baits are the mentioned triggers. This sounds very serious and methodic, but it isn't clear at all how Porter followed this method throughout his exposition. With that said, what is the first line of classes of emotions? Emotions are triggered by the quality or the kind of good and respectively of the evil which they condition or impart. Here, good and evil must be understood as pleasurable or hurtful, as we've seen in the previous video. These emotions, Porter highlights, are subject to degree or intensity, and quantity and quality. Next, Porter differentiates worth from value. Worth pertains to how much an object satisfies or afflicts the sensibilities. Value pertains to the embedded end or finality in the sensibilities, by which we can evaluate the worth of an object. Utility, on its turn, is the name we give to the relation between worth and value. In other words, it is the product of our rational evaluation of worth. Hence, utility can never be ascribed to any sensibilities, but only to the objects themselves. Object X is useful in virtue of a certain end and a certain expected worth. But the sensibilities, emotions proper and desires, are not useful in themselves. The evaluation of the usefulness of an object, therefore, must factor in its type, good or evil, its intensity, its quantity, and its special quality, how a specific sensation feels. Now, according to Porter, the sensibilities are also passive. That is, if the object is present and under our attention, which is the voluntary part, it will inevitably elicit the corresponding sensibility. The soul, as pure sensibility, can never withhold the appropriate emotion, but finds itself completely in the power and, so to speak, at the mercy of the objects with which it comes in contact. But by withdrawing the attention from the objects which excite them, and by fixing the attention on other objects, one can indirectly control one's sensibilities. This, as we've seen, is a recurring theme both in Porter and Alexander. Maybe because it was a hot topic in their time, maybe there were problems concerning the psychology of responsibility. Another hot topic back then, which will be my last video on Alexander, is habit or custom. Porter brings this topic to the table with the law of force by repetition. That is, the force of a sensibility is increased proportionally to its repetition. The more one allows or elicits a certain sensibility or set of them, the more easily the mind and body will produce them. There are three exceptions though. First, bodily appetites get weaker by indulging them. Second, the pleasure of novelty disappears very quickly once familiarity with the object is acquired. And third, mental adaptations to cope with unpleasant sensibilities. Examples for the first are addictions, may it be sugar or drugs. The more one gets used to them, the weaker their kick gets. Examples for the second are romantic passion and religious enthusiasm. Examples for the third is the phenomenon of desensitization. In war, a person at first might be paralyzed or vomit with sights of barbaric death, but it might get used to them by being indifferent. Porter adds something very important, that sensibilities are not merely passive. Yes, they are passive in regards to the emotions proper, but they are active in regards to the desires. This implies the sensibilities are partly passive and partly active. And by active, Porter means act impelling. Porter analyzes the desires into three impulses. First, an impulse to the satisfaction of the craved or repulsed feeling. Second, an impulse concerning the object which will gratify or avoid the feeling. And third, an impulse to spring the mind and body to proper action to bring about or repel the objects. It is because the sensibilities have this property of activity that many call them the active powers, as many in the common sensus tradition call. They are active precisely because they produce action, because they activate our powers, being mental or bodily. Sensibility, when transformed into desire, is not only bent upon gratification, but impels to action. Porter then objects against Kant concerning the claim that the will is our spring to action. The argument is very basic and can be constructed this way. Only humans have wills. The will is the mechanism by which action is produced. Therefore, only humans can act. But animals can also act. From the contradiction between gamma and delta, therefore, or alpha is false and animals also have wills, or beta is false and the will is not solely the mechanism by which action is produced. Zeta, there is positive evidence for the truth of alpha and the falsity of beta. From epsilon and zeta, therefore, the will is not solely the mechanism by which action is produced. The evidence for the truth of alpha is the observation of our own consciousness and the workings therein. The evidence for the falsity of beta is that the will is not needed to produce action, but only the sensibilities. Animals do not choose, they simply go after the strongest sensibilities. We human beings, on the other hand, have an intermediate power to change the objects under our attention or select the ones under it. We have, so to speak, an additional factor in the process of producing action. Next, Porter notes that the great diversity of individual differences between human beings also applies to the sensibilities. We all share the same native sensibilities, but every individual is born with special proclivities and has its own developmental history. This is the difference between natural differences and acquired differences. Under the acquired sensibilities, these can come about by education, by culture, by self-training, by negligent habit. There are many factors to name, but we can divide them all between external factors and internal factors. These acquired sensibilities are of supreme importance, much more than the native materials. The possibility of culture and its value depend on this ultimate fact. Culture and habit are as truly potent for evil as for good. The entire energies are now and then concentrated into one master passion, such as characterizes the saint, the fiend, or the brute. The appetite of the drunkard, the passion of the lustful, the demonism of the gambler, and the fiendishness of the revengeful are examples of such a secondary controlling and irresistible nature or passion. Even when evil impulses have ceased to be supreme, their natural effects on the habits and emotions remain, to act against the bent of the new voluntary life. All these activities, education, training, culture, are products of the will, and that means that there are sensibilities very much molded by our free wills, that is, voluntary sensibilities, and this will be our subject matter in the next video.